Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to get us started right on time if I can, because we have a lot of great stuff to pack into a very short time. My name is Lisa Schiltz. I'm the co-director of the Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy, and I co-direct this institute along with my colleague from the Department of Catholic Studies, Billy Junker, who I know is here, but I forgot my glasses today. There he is. Okay. The Murphy Institute is a co-venture between the Department of Catholic, Center for Catholic Studies and the School of Law at the University of St. Thomas. And this is another program in our series, Hot Topics, Cool Talk, in which we engage in discussion about issues that are of interest to Catholic thought from a variety of different perspectives. We are honored and happy to be co-hosting this one today with our Military Law Society. The format, let me explain briefly, of these programs is necessitated by our desire to be able to fit everything into 1 hour. We will have 15 minutes of comments from both of our participants, both of our speakers today. Then they will each be given a few minutes to react to each other's comments, and then we will engage in question and answer. And the only way we can fit this in less than 1 hour is by taking your questions during the conversation that occur to you and having you write them down on the bright pink cards that are at the end of every row. We will start during the discussion having two students going up and down the aisles collecting your cards. So if you have a question, put them down here. I'll be looking at the cards, and then I will, in the most efficient manner, try to get the most questions posed that we possibly can in our short time. We will end shortly before 1:30 because of people that have 1:30 classes. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Zach Lingus from our Military Law Society, who will introduce our two speakers. Thank you.
I've been told to keep this short, so I will. To my right is Professor Robert Delahaunty. Professor Delahaunty spent most of his legal career before joining the faculty at St. Thomas at the Office of Legal Counsel, where he was made special counsel and a member of the Senior Executive Service in 1992. His work in writing at the Office of Legal Counsel focused on the constitutional law of foreign relations, presidential war powers, public international law, treaties, and immigration law. And to my left is Joseph Grodahl Biever, a University of St. Thomas alumnus who obtained both a law degree and an MBA from this institution, and he is currently working on his master's degree in Catholic Studies. He was the first intern to work with the Caritas in Veritate Foundation, an organization that provides research support for the Holy See mission at the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. Mr. Grodahl Biever helped the Caritas in Veritate Foundation connect with a network of Catholic academic and other experts around the world to provide briefings and reports on issues ranging from human trafficking and modern slavery to patents on genetic resources to weaponized drones to religious freedom. And I don't know who's going first.
All right, thank you. Make sure I mic up here. All right, thank you. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The only value in nations possessing nuclear weapons is to make sure they will never be used. But then would it not be better to do away with them entirely? These are the words of Ronald Reagan in his State of the Union address in 1984. But this is not the 1980s. This is 2015. So why are we here talking about nuclear disarmament, a topic that probably strikes many of us as a relic of the past, of a Cold War era when the threat of mutually assured destruction loomed in our imaginations? Although I was born in the 80s, too young to remember firsthand, I think it's safe to say that the world of today is a very different world from the 1980s. For starters, the Soviet Union no longer exists. Yet I would argue that in terms of nuclear weapons, the world today is more dangerous, and the urgency of nuclear disarmament is more critical today than it was then. As Zach said, I had the opportunity recently, courtesy of the Murphy Institute, to work for a year as a research intern supporting the diplomatic mission of the Holy See, the Pope, to the United Nations in Geneva. Among other topics, I worked with the diplomats there on research into disarmament questions. Nuclear disarmament has always been a question of great concern for the Holy See, and one on which they continue to be actively engaged. Let me make the important disclaimer that I'm in no way whatsoever speaking on behalf of the Holy See today, but merely drawing upon my familiarity with their public positions on this question. With this in mind, I'll first offer a brief discussion of the Church's approach to this issue, including Pope Francis's recent statements, which issued a renewed call for the international community to get serious about achieving a world without nuclear weapons. And then follow that with my own take on how the United States should respond to the Pope's call by taking the lead and generating inertia for multilateral negotiations by first taking a drastic and unilateral drawdown of our own nuclear arsenal. A look at the Church's stance on nuclear weapons begins with the letter Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, by Pope St. John XXIII, which he wrote in 1963, just a few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a point in history when nuclear annihilation was at its closest. He said, "Justice, right reason, and the recognition of man's dignity cry out insistently for a cessation to the arms race. Nuclear weapons must be banned. A general agreement must be reached on a suitable disarmament program with an effective system of mutual control." At the Second Vatican Council, which had begun meeting at the time Pacem in Terris was promulgated, there was debate about how strongly the Church would condemn the nuclear arms race. Cardinal Ottaviani, who incidentally was also regarded as the leader of liturgical conservatives at the Council, came out strongly for declaring that even the possession of nuclear weapons was immoral. Several American bishops at the Council pushed back against this, viewing the policy of nuclear deterrence, of defending against the threat of use by another country, the Soviets, as necessary under the present circumstances, and therefore morally tolerable. The final text, which emerged from the Council in Gaudium et Spes in 1965, read, "Any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities or of extensive areas along with their population is a crime against God and man himself. It merits unequivocal and unhesitating condemnation." It sounds like a strong condemnation of the United States in particular, which remains, sadly, the only nation ever to deploy nuclear weapons on a civilian population. But the text went on to say, "Scientific weapons, to be sure, are not amassed solely for use in war, since the defensive strength of any nation is considered to be dependent upon its capacity for immediate retaliation. This accumulation of arms, which increases each year, likewise serves, in a way heretofore unknown, as a deterrent to possible enemy attack. Many regard this as the most effective way to which peace of a sort can be maintained between nations at the present time." This wasn't exactly a rousing endorsement of the policy of nuclear deterrence, but at least indicated that the Church had an understanding of the times. And the stance on nuclear deterrence was reiterated by St. John Paul II in a 1982 address to the UN General Assembly. In current conditions, deterrence based on balance, certainly not as an end in itself, but as a step on the way toward a progressive disarmament, may still be judged morally acceptable. Nonetheless, in order to ensure peace, it is indispensable not to be satisfied with this minimum, which is always susceptible to the real danger of explosion. Yet now that the Cold War is over, the Church perceives this justification as increasingly irrelevant to the times. While not outright declaring continued nuclear possession immoral, it appears to be moving in that direction the longer nations drag their feet on the work of nuclear disarmament. Continued possession of nuclear weapons today has led to continued proliferation, with nations responding to possession by other nations. And this proliferation leads to even greater risks, including the risk of accidental launch in nations which lack the same level of rigorous safety controls we have, or the risk of weapons falling into the hands of irresponsible actors such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda. One particularly nightmarish yet plausible scenario is the idea of Pakistan, a nation which now has over 100 nuclear weapons, suddenly collapsing into political chaos, and in the confusion, some of their weapons falling into the hands of the Taliban or some other radicals in the neighborhood. These are not scenarios anyone wants to see. Today's situation is very different from the comparatively simpler Cold War era of deterrence between the US and the Soviet Union. It's in this post-Cold War era that the Church has more forcefully questioned the moral justification for possession of nuclear weapons and of the policy of nuclear deterrence. For the 2009 World Day of Peace, Pope Benedict asked, what can be said about those governments which count on nuclear weapons as a means of ensuring the security of their countries? Along with countless persons of goodwill, one can state that this point of view is not only baneful, but also completely fallacious. And in a statement at the 2013 UN High-Level Dialogue on Nuclear Disarmament, Pope Francis's message was delivered. Concern over the proliferation of nuclear weapons into other countries ring hollow as long as the nuclear weapons states hold on to their nuclear weapons. The chief obstacle to starting this work is continued adherence to the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. With the end of the Cold War, the time for the acceptance of this doctrine is long past. The Holy See does not countenance the continuation of nuclear deterrence, since it is evident it is driving the development of ever newer nuclear arms, thus preventing genuine nuclear disarmament. And again this past December, my former boss, the Papal Nuncio in Geneva, delivered the words of Pope Francis again. Nuclear deterrence and the threat of mutually assured destruction cannot be the basis for an ethic of fraternity and peaceful coexistence among peoples and states. Now is the time to counter the logic of fear with the ethic of responsibility, and so foster a climate of trust and sincere dialogue. I think the overall message is clear. The time is now, and there is no further justification for the continued possession of nuclear weapons. In light of this, I believe that we as the United States must take leadership of this cause of nuclear disarmament. If there's one thing I learned during my time in the United Nations, it's that if there's not a nation or a small group of nations spearheading a particular issue, the issue goes absolutely nowhere. And this is where nuclear disarmament has been stuck for years on end. There have never been any true multilateral negotiations on nuclear disarmament. Only incremental bilateral talks between the two largest holders of nuclear weapons, the United States and Russia. So I believe it's the responsibility of the United States to be that nation spearheading this effort, if for no other reason than simple childhood playground morality. We started it. We are the only ones who have ever used these weapons, and we must bear some level of moral responsibility for the enormous humanitarian consequences of future nuclear incidents wherever they may happen in the world. General James Cartwright, former commander of U.S. Strategic Command, which oversees our nuclear arsenal, signed on to a 2012 report that floats the idea of unilateral nuclear disarmament down to a level minimally required for deterrence, by his estimation, from the 7,000 plus we currently have down to 900, and doing this unilateral disarmament as a way to jumpstart the world's first multilateral negotiations, which at this point have absolutely no impetus behind them. I echo this argument, but I argue further for a more drastic reduction below that of other nuclear powers in order to jumpstart negotiations. Now, some may say that we seem to be entering a new Cold War with Russia, and that therefore it's the wrong time to be moving away from our policy of nuclear deterrence. I happen to be writing a forthcoming article on the topic of this so-called new Cold War with Russia for a publication called the News Memo. And in looking at this, it seems to me at least that Putin and Russia are more motivated by a desire to regain some of their lost respect and standing in the world, rather than by some diametrically opposed ideology they seek to spread around the globe, as we saw with the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, who with Reagan and John Paul II, I think can rightly be credited with ending the Cold War, has long been one of the strongest critics of Putin from inside Russia. Yet he and 80% of the Russian people have changed their tune and approve of Putin following his annexation of Crimea last year. In an interview with Time magazine, Gorbachev said, "In the years that followed the Soviet collapse, the West tried to turn us into some kind of backwater, a province. Our nation could not let that pass. It's not just about pride. It's about a situation where people speak to you however they want, impose limitations, and so on. It's America calling the shots and everything. And we can argue with this, but I think Gorbachev has earned the right as a man to be at least listened to." And, pardon me. If we try to understand where Russia is coming from, then hopefully we can see what is called for today in regards to our relationship with Russia and with nuclear disarmament in general. And I believe that what is called for today from us is humility in the form of a drastic and unilateral reduction in our nuclear arsenal. Such humility would not be to the exclusion of strength, as we would remain the strongest nation on earth without question, and we could still respond forcefully to situations like the one we currently are seeing in Ukraine. But this would be a humility in the style of servant leadership, an example that we as Catholics are familiar with. And this servant leadership would capture the attention of other nations and move us onto the path toward a nuclear-free world. I'll close with going back to the words of John the 23rd in his letter Pacem in Terris. True and lasting peace among nations cannot consist in the possession of an equal supply of armaments, but only in mutual trust. Ronald Reagan was fond of saying, nations do not distrust each other because they are armed. They are armed because they distrust each other. And this wisdom is especially true with regard to the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. Building trust and mutual understanding among peoples is our mission, both for policymakers and for us as individuals. Let's all take that to heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. This occasion will demonstrate the difficulties a teacher has in debating with a former student, because you've already told the student everything you know, and they have their own independent knowledge, so they're bound to win, and rightly so. I want to thank Professor Schultz and Professor Juncker and the military law students for inviting me here and for hosting this occasion. There is a substantial amount of agreement between me and Mr. Grodahl about these imperative, vitally important issues. I am especially grateful to the Pope for highlighting them and bringing them again to the world's attention. These are not issues left over from the Cold War. They are current and pressing. I want to do four basic things in the time I have. First of all, I want to encourage everyone to think about these issues in a certain kind of way. Second, I want to review very briefly the Cold War situation and see if there's anything we can learn from it. Third, I want, again very briefly, to talk about our current situation. And finally, I want to evaluate the options for going forward. How should we think about these issues? We should think about them not in a linear fashion, but in a strategic fashion. In this kind of area, a straight line is not necessarily the shortest distance between 2 points. If you want to get to a world utterly free of nuclear weapons, unilateral disarmament may not, in fact, be the most straightforward and effective way to get there. And indeed, you may have to settle for something that is less than perfect. Disarmament might, in other words, increase the risk of war and make the planet less safe. On the other hand, an arms buildup might conceivably drive down the level of risk rather than heighten it. That's a possibility I think we have to keep in mind, at least. Let me give you an example from Herbert Butterfield, who was a brilliant historian at Cambridge University and a Methodist minister, a very powerful witness for his Christian faith. He raised the possibility of leaving a house door open, the back door open, out of trust for your neighbors, and that might create an irresistible temptation for them to enter the house and steal from it. Who, he asked, would be to blame for the theft He said, the homeowner who leaves the door open at least as much as the thief. Think of that as a potential analogy to defensive weapons. If you simply get rid of your defensive weapons, it's like leaving the house door open. It might invite an attack that otherwise would not have happened. This seems to be, to some extent, the verdict of history. In the Second World War, the British were known to have stockpiled massive quantities of poison gas for use against the Germans. The Germans also had gas. The result of this mutual knowledge was that the gas was not used in the Second World War, although it had been used extensively in the First. I said a minute ago, we have to think strategically. Let me answer the example I've just given with another. Sometimes it doesn't happen that an arms race or an arms buildup prevents the use of those weapons. In the First World War, the Russian financier Ivan Bloch argued a few years before the war that the militaries of Europe had perfected such dreadful and expensive weapons that they would never be used, that there would be a continuing peace in Europe. The experience a few years later of the First World War proved that prediction, sadly, to be false. The dreadful weapons became more dreadful, the expensive weapons became more expensive. So we have to puzzle our way through this. Now, in the Cold War, both sides adopted the strategy of MAD, mutual assured destruction. It was really like the threat of the use of poison gas in the Second World War. MAD was condemned by some Catholic thinkers, notably John Finnis and Germain Grisey, on the grounds that it was evil to threaten to do what it would be wrong in fact to do, and MAD was predicated on the threat of taking down urban population centers filled with innocent people in both the Soviet Union and the United States. It was wrong to threaten to use nuclear weapons in that counter-value kind of way. Maybe they could be used, their use could be threatened in a counter-force kind of way if they were aimed at military silos or bases, but not when they were aimed against innocent people living in Moscow or New York. That, I don't know, seems never to have become the official teaching of the Catholic Church, although it had distinguished support. On the other side, there were people who argued, and I think I am inclined to be one of them, that MAD prevented a nuclear holocaust, that it prevented a thermonuclear war, or indeed any kind of major war in Europe, that the threat of massive retaliation against civilian populations held both sides in check. It was a kind of dramatic extension of the hostage situation, which two sides exchange hostages with each other as a guarantee of, as a pledge of good behavior. That was actually frequently done in the Middle Ages and later. And it seems to be a method by which two warring sides can keep the peace, maintain some kind of truce between themselves. I think, in effect, what the MAD strategy was a kind of hostage exchange. It also achieved something that the originator of MAD, President Dwight Eisenhower, hoped to achieve by it. He did not want the United States to be funding exorbitant defense budgets. He thought that that would be damaging to our civil liberties and to our economic health, and so he chose to bulk up on nuclear weaponry. The fact is that we did survive the Cold War in economic good health and with our civil liberties largely intact, despite a prolonged period of being on something like a war footing. So there were advantages to MAD, even though morally it is questionable. Are things different now? There are many distinguished people who think that, yes, they are different, but the difference does not result in a reduction of the risk level of nuclear war. In fact, it may be heightened in the post-Cold War period. This is a view that is held across the political spectrum. Of course, it is a signature theme for President Obama, but also for people like Mikhail Gorbachev and for elder statesmen like Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and Sam Nunn. And most recently, of course, it's the view expressed by the Pope. We have to listen respectfully to figures with such moral clarity and experience of the world as these men. Philip Taubman, a few years ago, a writer for the New York Times, made this point in stressing the dangers posed by today's geopolitical conditions for nuclear safety. He said, the new appeal of an old idea that has long seemed quixotic, that is getting to zero, is driven by the rise of new nuclear threats that in some ways make the nuclear equation more ominous and volatile than it was during the Cold War, even though there are far fewer weapons now. Mr. Obama, Taubman continued, said it himself in Prague, in a strange turn of history, the threat of global nuclear war has gone down, but the risk of a nuclear attack has gone up. I agree completely with Taubman and Obama. First of all, there is a greater fear now than there was in the 1980s of proliferation, especially among what we call rogue states, including North Korea and Iran. But beyond that, there's the fear that if we have proliferation to these rogue states, then states that we don't consider rogue states may have to respond by developing nuclear forces of their own, such as Saudi Arabia or possibly Japan. Second, there's the risk, which Joe pointed out, of state failure that might end up with nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands and their use against innocent people. And finally, there is, of course, the risks that somehow the terrorists might develop their own or purchase some from countries that haven't failed but that are willing to sell them. Contrary to that, and I don't want to take sides on this, there is a view of some international relations theorists that proliferation would actually be stabilizing, or that it might be. For example, at the University of Chicago, Professor John Mearsheimer has been arguing recently and also 10 or more years ago that Ukraine should have kept its nuclear weapons because what has been happening in Ukraine would have been inconceivable if the Russians thought that they were facing the possibility of a nuclear counterattack. I don't want to get into the debate. I want to assume that a nuclear-free world or something close to it would be a better world in every way. That really matters. And the question then is, how do we get there? What are our options? Well, one obvious option would be unilateral U.S. nuclear disarmament. Just get to zero ourselves. Another, short of that, might be a substantial reduction of our nuclear stockpile down to 900 warheads or fewer, even. I'm not an expert on this, but there are some who say that the level of which national security would require is 2,000, but let's say it's 900 or below. That's one possibility, the most dramatic one, the starkest one, and in some ways a very attractive one. But what would be the strategic effects of this? What demonstration effects would it have if the United States unilaterally disarmed itself of nuclear weaponry? Would other nations give up their arsenals? Would they abandon their programs, or would the opposite happen? Now, we don't know, of course, but we have to try to make educated guesses. And I want to divide up my answer into three possibilities. What would hostile nations, potentially hostile nations like Russia do? What would friendly nuclear-armed nations like Israel do? And what would friendly non-nuclear powers like Japan do in the event of unilateral nuclear disarmament by the United States? Russia in recent years has been building up its nuclear forces and even, I'm afraid, threatening to use them against NATO. It is doing this because it cannot compete with the US in the area of conventional forces, and it fears us with some reason. So because of the presence, our clear edge in conventional forces, Russia is developing its nuclear forces. It's kind of a switch of roles. In the 1950s, they had the conventional edge, and we developed nuclear weaponry to counter that. Russia's nuclear program is very unlikely, in my judgment, to be abandoned simply because the US disarmed. Unilateral action of that kind by us would not dispel what Russia truly fears, which is our ascendancy in conventional weapons. To get Russia to give up its nuclear weaponry, we'd have to give up our lead in conventional force. And if we did that, I think that that would endanger our national security probably too much. Second, what would happen if we had a nuclear stand-down unilaterally in the case of friendly but nuclear-armed nations like Israel or maybe Britain and France? I think there's a chance, a good chance, that if they saw us do that, they would bulk up on their nuclear weaponry to make good the deficit. They might feel more exposed to a nuclear attack, and because of that, they might adopt more nuclear countermeasures. And finally, what about friendly non-nuclear powers like Japan or Taiwan or Saudi Arabia? Well, I think that Japan in particular, which has enjoyed the benefits of the American nuclear umbrella since 1945, might feel dreadfully exposed and start in developing its own nuclear program. There are other options. I don't have time to discuss them all right now. They're interesting. They might be of some marginal utility, at least. There could be no first strike pledges that we unilaterally issued. There could be a U.S. stand down in producing fissionable materials, or there could be a U.S. ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I do not think that those proposals would actually get us much closer to a nuclear-free world in the end. But I do have something positive to say. I don't mean to be just a skeptic. What I invite you all to consider, and I stress I'm not an expert on this, is the development of a nuclear shield program. To some extent, that is already in place in the U.S. with the Aegis system, for example, on our submarines. Israel has dramatically shown what nuclear shield programs can do with its Iron Dome program, which is currently being used against Hamas, and Israel is also involved in missile shield programs against not just short-range missiles, but medium-range and long-range missiles. David's Sling and the Arrow 1, 2, 3 programs are of that nature. There are obvious, clear objections to reliance on nuclear shield programs. They're expensive. They may not work. If they do work, they will only work, at least in our current state of science, most of the time and not all of the time. But the worst objection is that a nuclear shield program would incentivize Russia to strike preemptively. And indeed, the Russians have threatened to do that. So the argument against this way forward is, if you have nuclear shield programs, as you start developing them, as you start putting them in place, you will incite the Russians to use their nuclear weapons preemptively. You will make the world more dangerous in nuclear terms rather than less. I have an answer to that. Share our knowledge with the Russians and share it with anybody else who is interested. Say to them, we don't want this just for ourselves. We want you to have it and China to have it. Share the costs, share the research, but let's protect all our populations from terrorists who might use nuclear weapons or others who might pose dangers. We trust you enough to share it. To this point, to the best of my knowledge, we have declined to do that. The Russians have expressed some interest. We have declined to do that. I think if we had nuclear shield programs that we shared with the countries that are most likely to attack us with nuclear weapons, we might certainly not have a world in which there were zero nuclear weapons, but a world that was much safer against the risk of a nuclear attack.
Thank you. Oops, I should turn my microphone on again, sorry. Just a few thoughts that I had. I think it is an important point to for everyone to look at in terms of what would be the consequences around the world if the United States were to drastically draw down their nuclear forces. And certainly that's a question that is out there of how would Russia respond, how would our allies respond, how would presently non-nuclear nations respond. I would say that, first of all, I wouldn't necessarily advocate for a 100% immediate drawdown of our arsenal, but down to something like a token, something around the level of what India and Pakistan currently have of around 100, which is well below the United Kingdom, France, China, Israel. And this move would still maintain a pack a punch from our end and keep our place at the negotiating table. But it's the only way that I have seen, just by my limited exposure to the endless discussions one sees at the United Nations and other places, to really get multilateral negotiations going. There have never been multilateral negotiations on this issue. And we've seen success in banning certain weapon systems in multilateral negotiations. The landmines is the top example that comes to mind for me. And so there's definite reason to be hopeful in multilateral negotiations. In terms of what we may have to give the Russians to give their assurances and not make them scared of our superiority in other weapons, I think that's an issue for another day, but it could be part of those negotiations. I think the real point is getting those negotiations going, because there's no real drive for it now. There have never been multilateral negotiations, and we need that to happen. And I believe, personally, that the only way to get that to happen is to see the United States remain strong, but send a strong message of humility at the same time. I also share Professor Delahaunty's enthusiasm for the idea of sharing a nuclear shield. I think that's a good step in the right direction because it's sort of an example of a defensive weapon as an offensive weapon, is what the argument has been made against nuclear shields. But I would come back to the idea of a strong unilateral reduction in our nuclear arsenal, and why now? What's the urgency of it to get these negotiations started? I think that right now, today, the situation we find ourselves in is the right time and a pressing time to take advantage of the time we find ourselves in. There's increasing dangers and risks around the world, as we've discussed, with nuclear proliferation, and we're currently, the arsenals of both Russia and the U.S. are at a point where they're needing drastic investments in being upgraded in order to be operational. And Russia's already currently doing some of this, but it's estimated that Russia will have to spend, I believe it was $10 billion over the next 10 years to upgrade their weaponry, and something like $30 billion for us over the next 20 years. So it's a lot of money, and over the next 10 years, it's estimated that the world will spend around $1 trillion in maintaining and upgrading nuclear weaponry. And so we're at a point, just in terms of budgetary reasons, where there's a reason for urgency. And then a more esoteric reason that I think now is the right time is the opportunity to capitalize on the popularity and the track record of being a go-between of Pope Francis. This may sound a little out there, but we've seen some success with the negotiation of U.S.-Cuba, and I think there's reason to believe that there's hope for an increasing understanding between Russia and the West, which is ultimately historically rooted in the split between Orthodox and Catholic. And I think if we, as Catholics and Orthodox and other believers, can come together and help bridge understanding between the two, I think that can be an important opportunity. But I think that the time is now to take advantage of this man who is somehow still extremely popular, and we should take advantage of it. So with that, those are my thoughts. Thank you.
We have a number of questions that were aimed at Mr. Grodahl, that were basically asking him what he thought of the various, how would disarmament look, and what he thought of Professor Delahaunty's shield proposal, and I think he answered them in his remarks. So I'm not asking those questions, it's because I think some of those were addressed. But I do have a question then that was posed to both of them. In light of the increasing salience of recent cyber attacks, is the case for disarmament strengthened on the grounds that threat of launch by hackers exists?
Can I say something about that? One, this is a very complicated puzzle, and there are a lot of pieces to it. One piece is this. Suppose we have a world that is at zero nuclear weapons. We would all feel a lot better, we would all feel a lot safer. But maybe that world is also necessarily going to be a world in which the nations invest much more in other types of warfare. So a world that is nuclear free might be a world in which cyber war was vastly more likely and vastly more devastating. If you press the balloon at one place, it might just expand at another. So to be even a little more specific, the question of hacking is also a problem with missile shields. The Israelis may have experienced some hacking into their missile shield program. And it might also be, I don't know, I'm sure this is highly classified information, that one reason our government and our military have rejected Russian offers to participate in the missile shields we're developing is that if you know how to build them, you know more readily how to hack into them. So it's really, really hard to take a step forward in this area without the threat of moving 2 steps backward.
I think that answered it.
This is perhaps another question about the shields, and then I'll move on to some other things. Would a shield program encourage the development of nuclear weapons in an effort to overwhelm the defense with multiple nukes being fired at once, i.e. a shotgun approach?
Of course, that's a possibility. Yes. Again, this is really emphasizing the strategic quality of the thinking here. To develop a defense against current nuclear arsenals might lead some states to invest more in building up bigger arsenals in the hopes that they could overwhelm the shield. That's a possibility. My thought was just that if both of us agree, some dramatic diplomatic initiative is needed, some coup d'etat, right? We may disagree about what it is, but there are no guarantees. It's just that if you build up trust, you may reduce the incentives for doing that kind of thing, the shotgun approach.
I have a question here for Mr. Grodahl. How would disarmament by the U.S. address what you identified as the real motive of Putin et al. In recent aggressions, i.e. the lack of respect, authority on the world stage? Wouldn't something more or different be needed?
Well, I think that perhaps more would be needed in order to, and this goes along with Professor Delahaunty's earlier mention of Russia's feeling threatened by our superiority in conventional weapons, that there would be those issues that would need to be addressed. But I think the point of it is to bring Russia to the table of serious multilateral disarmament negotiations. I think that's the real point, and it's a complex issue with multiple, if this happens, then this might happen scenario as we've gone over, and we don't get to start getting to the bottom of all of those complex issues without multilateral negotiations actually happening. And that's what we've been missing for all of these years.
Maybe, I don't want to overstress this, but I think to a very substantial extent, the problem of nuclear disarmament is a problem of U.S.-Russian relations. It's not entirely that. Of course, India and Pakistan, say, are involved. China does not actually maintain a large nuclear force. Mm-hmm. And the U.S.-Russia relationship is itself embedded in a host of other problems. The Russians, in my opinion, with some reason, feel suspicious of us. They are aggrieved by NATO's expansion up to their very borders, especially in the Baltics. They thought Secretary of State James Baker had promised them it would not happen. Baker denies that, but that's what the Russians sincerely believe, and it has happened. NATO includes Poland. NATO includes the Baltics. Russia also fears the Bush initiative, which has been renewed by this administration to have a missile shield ostensibly against Iran, but stationed in NATO countries. We are aggrieved with Russia over Ukraine and Georgia, but they're aggrieved with us over Kosovo. It really is time for what the president called a Russia reset. I am not sure he is the right president at this point in his administration to do it.
I think there's a feeling that there's been a little bit too much agreement between the two of you. I have a question for both. I disagree with both of you. Look at the first half of the 20th century without nuclear weapons. Then look at the second half. Violence, war, and civilian casualties were far reduced in the second half because of nukes, correct?
Correct. And actually, the church has even said this. During the Second Vatican Council, that's the reason why the Council and the Gaudium et Spes did not outright condemn all possession of nuclear weapons, because they understood that in the context of the Cold War, with two superpowers competing around the globe for spreading their respective ideologies, that this was, for lack of a better word, a necessary evil, and really was morally tolerable to have. And it really did help. I think that's a strong argument to make, that really did help to maintain some level of peace around the world. But we're not in the Cold War anymore. And we haven't seen any catastrophes happen yet, but there's no reason to just sit around and wait for it to happen. I think that there's increasing likelihood of it happening. We look at North Korea has upwards of 10 nuclear weapons, and they are completely willing to sell it to whoever wants, unless Beijing steps in to stop them. But Pakistan and India, who knows what will ever happen in their relationship, but also Pakistan has the very real possibility of suddenly collapsing, and it's got a strong presence of radical fundamentalist Islamists that oppose the government and may at any time bring the country into chaos, and then who knows what will happen to their nuclear arsenal. So I think it is a very different world that we live in today.
I also would say to the questioner, correct, that it is, I think, a very powerful view, well-argued view, that the long peace of Europe after 1945 is largely due to the nuclear arsenals of NATO and the US and the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. And I think that's a thesis that is well defended in the literature of international relations. Indeed, I think I specifically said that. There's also an argument which I reserved, which is made by Kenneth Waltz, who was the dean of American international relations theorists, that nuclear proliferation is good, that Iran should have nuclear weapons, and so should the Saudis. Pakistan should have them, and so should India. That the more proliferation you have, the less risk you have of nuclear war. It is a kind of nuclear shield if everybody has nuclear weapons. I don't know if that's true. It's obviously controversial, but Kenneth Waltz is a figure to be reckoned with. I would reserve that because I think that calls into question the predicate of this debate, and certainly of the Pope's remarks, that we would be better off in a nuclear-free world. But it might be true. Waltz might be right.
Another question for both of you. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, is the largest single-issue peace movement in the UK, arguably the largest in all of Europe since 1957. Has there been any similar traction in the U.S. with peace groups here in terms of strategy or knowledge transfer? And I'd like to expand on that a little bit more. I'm very intrigued by the proposal to share the knowledge of the defense shields with the supposed enemies that we've identified here. I'd like to hear your reaction to how realistic that might be, or any discussion from both of you about how realistic something like that might be. Has that ever happened in the history of warfare or in international relations, and how likely is that to actually happen? Could that be the bold step forward that the U.S. could take rather than disarming that might have that same effect on the world stage?
Could you repeat the first part of the question there?
The what I read here?
Yes.
The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, is the largest single-issue peace movement in the UK, arguably the largest in all of Europe since 1950, either 1 or 7, I can't read. Has there been any similar traction in the US with peace groups here in terms of strategy or knowledge transfer, which I guess maybe I misread. Maybe the questioner meant between the UK group and the US, but I was thinking about the question about knowledge transfer and strategy because of the comments that Professor Delahaunty raised. So if you want to answer both or either, I'd be grateful. Thanks.
I think just to answer the first part of the question of peace movements in the U.S., I think the most, it strikes me as the most credible group out there in terms of impact called Global Zero, which is the organization that issued that report that the general of the Strategic Command, former general of the Strategic Command signed on to, I think is such a group, and they do call for unilateral disarmament up to that point of minimal deterrence. But in there, they also do argue for these multilateral negotiations as the central key to achieving this world without nuclear weapons. And part of that would be sharing the technology necessary to protect everyone from a nuclear attack of any kind or an accidental launch or what have you. So I think that's perhaps getting at the question, I hope. Do you have anything to add?
Very briefly, I don't really know much about CND. There's another very powerful peace movement and anti-nuclear movement. It's called the Catholic Church. And I respect their opinions. The United States once offered to do something as dramatic as what I'm suggesting now, and it fizzled out. It was right after the Second World War in 1946, and we had the atomic bomb. And President Truman listened to the advice of the State Department and to one of his senior counselors, Bernard Baruch, who had served in other Democratic administrations. And he allowed Baruch to offer the Soviet Union under Stalin the so-called Baruch Plan. Now, the Soviets at this point did not have the atomic bomb. We had uncontested supremacy, and we offered to work with them on an arrangement to vest all atomic weapons in existence or to be developed into an agency of the United Nations. No nation would have its own nuclear weaponry. Such nuclear weaponry as there was or would be under the control of the United Nations. There would be, in effect, shared knowledge. And the reason for doing this was the sense that although nuclear energy had devastating uses, which we'd seen in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it also offered the promise of peaceful uses that were very desirable. So we wanted to encourage the nations of the world to develop their knowledge of the atom, but not to exploit it for warfare, and this was the plan. The Soviets rejected it rather brusquely, and then the Americans withdrew it. So there was that brief moment of promise which came to nothing. The Cold War was just about to start. Maybe Stalin was even tougher to negotiate with than Putin. Anyway, it didn't happen. It might have. That's the only historical instance I can think of.
Mr. Grodahl, do you have any sense, then, just to follow up on that, about how something like that would play in the world stage and whether that might be the dramatic movement that the United States could make again now, the proposal to create a defense shield and share the knowledge with China and Russia?
Well, I think I'll admit that personally, before going off to the UN in Geneva, I was a little bit skeptical of the United Nations, just as a general concept, and my skepticism is completely gone from that. It's a necessary effort to bring nations of the world together, and I think that it's the proper forum of some kind of international organization, like the International Atomic Energy Commission is what comes to mind, that already exists, but empowering them with some kind of whatever mechanism would be acceptable to all nuclear states currently, to be that body which oversees proliferation, which oversees nuclear weaponry. I think that's really the only realistic solution. I think that brings everyone to the table, and it takes away that threat. The fundamental problem that we have is the mutual distrust of one another in the world, and that's what takes that away. And I think that's ultimately the most plausible long-term solution. The details of exactly how it would look, would be worked out in those multilateral negotiations. But that is, I think, the most reasonable.
Unfortunately now, because one of the people that does have a 1:30 class is Professor Delahaunty, I do have to end this program. I hope we can continue the conversation out in the hall and later. Join me in thanking our two participants. I want to bring to your attention the two upcoming programs of the Murphy Institute, the CLE information for this program. Stephen Justice does Believing Corrupt Thinking in the St. Paul campus. And then back here again, another hot topic.